Hello, everybody. So we are now 2 days away from the May 2025 IB Economics exams, and I will continue with this series of videos on how to prepare for the exams and how to do the best possible job when writing each paper. I've already recorded and posted two videos, one for paper one, the essay paper, one for paper two, the data response. Um, and today we will focus on paper three. Of course, everything that I explained in the previous videos for the essay for the data response remain relevant for paper 3, and that's why this video is likely to be shorter than the other ones, because it will simply build up on what was already explained previously. So if you have not yet watched the two previous videos, I strongly recommend that you do. So you have the most comprehensive understanding of the format of the examinations and how to achieve the best possible grade in each paper. So for today's video focusing on paper 3, we will start looking at the format of the examination, the structure, like the reviewing the instructions that you will be given at the beginning of the exams. Then we will briefly summarize the main types of questions that you may face on the day of the exam. And then to conclude, we will have a closer look at the policy recommendations, which is like the part B of question one and question two, which is something a bit different from a task that is quite different from writing an essay or even writing the answer to the final question of paper two. So that's why I want to dedicate some time to give tips, advices on how to best approach the policy recommendation. Okay, let's start with summarizing some key information about paper 3. You will have, of course, the instructions written on the cover page, and do not skip them. Make sure you allocate a few minutes to just read them carefully to ensure that you are basically doing what you are asked. Okay? You will have 1 hour 45 minutes to write this paper, 60 marks overall, which means that you should roughly spend a bit less than 2 minutes per mark. Okay, so if you have like a four marker, it should be less than 8 minutes. Like the exact number would be 1 minute and 45 seconds per mark. So you can do the math if you want. But for the two 10 markers, that means that you should roughly spend 17, 18 minutes for each policy recommendation. So yeah, in terms of time management, make sure that you um, allocate your time as well as possible. As I'll explain, you will have two questions to answer. Each question accounts for 30 marks. So that means that you should spend approximately for 52 minutes per question. You will be allowed to use a calculator, of course. Make sure you bring it with you on the day of the exam. And the tricky part about paper 3 is that you must answer all questions. You don't get to pick which question you want to answer. So that is very different from paper 1 and paper 2. Paper 1, you get to choose one question, one essay question out of three. Very flexible. Paper 2, you get to choose one question out of two. You still have some flexibility, even though it is a bit more limited than in paper 1. But paper 3, you see, absolutely no flexibility. You must answer absolutely everything. Of course, you know that paper 3 is an exam that only HL students are taking, but that does not mean that it will target HL content only. Okay, of course, some questions will specifically target the HL content of the syllabus, but others can be covering topics that both HL and SL students have studied. My point is that when preparing for paper 3, make sure you do not excessively focus on the HL content. Okay, do not overlook the rest of the syllabus, because absolutely everything can be tested in paper 3. Another difference of paper 3 is that you do not answer on answer sheets, but instead you answer directly on the question paper. There will be answer boxes on which you will write your answers. But keep in mind, and it's important to know that you can request additional paper if you feel like the answer boxes are too small and you would like to write more content. You can, and in fact you should, definitely request for additional answer sheets so you can just expand your answers, and that is particularly relevant for the policy recommendations. In my opinion, the answer boxes for the policy recommendations, they tend to be too small, so feel free to request additional paper. Just write your candidate number, the question number, and you're good to go. In the instructions, you will be reminded that whenever some calculations must be completed, you need to round your results to two decimal places, like 14.43, 24.39. Okay, so two decimal places. Something else that is reminded in the instructions is that you are expected to show your work. So again, this is particularly important for questions involving calculations. What do we mean by show your work? It usually means that there are three stages that you have to follow and to show explicitly in your answer. Stage one, you write the formula that you are using to compute the calculation, to perform the calculation. Stage two, you replace the elements in the formula. You have these elements and you replace them with the data that is provided. Okay, so if you have, like, for example, if you're expected to calculate an elasticity, you start by giving the general definition of an elasticity. And then in that formula, stage two, you replace like percentage change in price, percentage change in quantity demanded by the actual values provided in the text or in the table or in the diagram. And stage three, you can simply write the result. And be careful, as I explained in the previous video, make sure that you use the proper units, okay? Are you calculating something that is expressed in dollars, something that is expressed in bushels of wheat? So pay attention to the units. You will have to use diagrams. There are many questions where you have to sketch or to draw a diagram to support an explanation. So make sure they are fully labeled. Follow all the recommendations I gave on how to use diagrams in the best possible way. And that's about it for the recommendations. So you'll have two questions, question one, question two. You have to answer both, and all questions from the exam paper. Each question is divided into part A and part B. Okay, part B of each question will be the policy recommendation. We're going to talk about that. And now what I want to do is to just briefly outline the different types of questions that you can face in part A of question one and question two. But you will see they are very similar to the questions that you can face in paper two. Just so you know, you will be provided with information, just like in paper two. Usually you don't have long texts like in paper two, but you will be provided with some information. It could be text, could be tables with data, could be diagrams, okay, like trends on how, let's say, the rate of inflation change over time, things like that. So text, tables, diagrams, and you will have questions. Some of them will be pretty generic, meaning that you do not need to use the data or the information provided to answer. You know, like if you have to define common pool resource, you don't really need the data to answer that. But of course, most questions will specifically relate to the information that is presented to you. So for calculations, if there is a particular a case of an externality, if you have to describe a trend, to identify a characteristic, okay, so quite often you will have to, your answers will be based on the information that is provided. Okay, so what are the major types of questions that you can face in part A? Definitions. You will probably have at least two definitions, one in question one in question two, maybe more. Usually 2 marks for definitions. Calculations. as discussed earlier. So yeah, you will have like a lot of yeah, elements to calculate. Could be a change in consumer surplus, it could be a tax revenue, it could be a rate of inflation, it could be the size of a deadweight loss. Okay, there are many different things that you might be able to and expected to calculate. You will also be expected to use diagrams to explain something, very similar to paper two questions. So in that case, you have to draw the diagram and below the diagram to provide the expected explanations. So these are the main ones, really, like define, calculate, and using a diagram, explain. I went through the most recent paper threes, and there are a few questions that are phrased slightly differently, but basically it's going to be very similar. Sometimes you expect it to outline something, and sometimes you can be expected to explain something. So what's the difference between explain and outline? Outline tends to be very brief, a summary, the key ideas. Explained is expected to be a bit more detailed. Okay, so that's why usually the outline questions, they you have usually 2 marks associated with them. The explain questions have 4 marks associated to them. So explain, like deeper analysis, outline, okay, just like a very brief description of something. Um, Okay, so these really are the main types of questions. Sometimes you may be expected to identify something, to determine something, to describe information. So these tend to be questions that carry only a single mark. But again, most questions involve definitions, calculations, explanations. Some of these explanations are supported with diagrams. Okay, so let's have a closer look at the questions. Question B, question 1B, question 2B, the policy recommendation. So for question 1B and 2B, the policy recommendations, they are all phrased the same way. Using the text data and your knowledge of economics, recommend one policy that the government of blah 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 could use to achieve whatever objective. Could be to control inflation, to prevent the depreciation of the currency, to address negative externality. Okay, so we have an economic issue, a specific economic issue, which you know about because you studied economics. So okay, and also because you were provided with data, information about that particular economic issue. And your job is to recommend one policy to address that particular issue. Okay, there are many things that we must say about that particular question and how to answer it. But let me start with what, in my opinion, is the most important and the strategy that is really going to make a difference for you. On the day of the exam, once you reach these questions, try to forget you are a student and instead pretend you are an economic advisor working for the government and being tasked with analyzing the economic issue and making a report on what we should do. Okay, so of course I know it is easier said than done. Like forgetting we are a student when we are in the exam room, it may be difficult, but trying to put yourself in that state of mind, and recognizing that, okay, you have skills already. You studied economics for at least 2 years. You are all very capable economists. And provided with that data, you can actually have an informed opinion on what the best course of action is. And I feel like trying to put ourselves in the shoes of a policy advisor, an economic advisor, it really helps to understand what is expected from you. For example, you're not there to make a list of everything we could do. That's not your job. And that's typical mistake that students make when attempting to answer that question. Your job is not to list every single possibility. Oh, maybe we could raise taxes. Oh, maybe we should raise the interest rates. Oh, maybe we could cut government. No, that's not what you expected to do. You have to analyze the data, the text, the diagrams, the tables, and using your own knowledge of economics to determine what is, in your opinion, because of course it's subjective, there are many possible solutions to the same problem, but in your opinion, given what you know about economics and given the data that you're provided, to recommend one single response, like government response to that particular issue. Okay. It is important that the policy recommendation that you make is relevant, of course, that it is potentially effective to address the issue, and that is what you will have to explain. And it is also important that you justify why, given the data and the information that you have, why it is your professional opinion that this policy is the best, is the most suitable policy response to the economic issue that we are facing. Okay, so obviously, in your answer, it will be very important to use the information that is provided, okay? Because it is one thing to explain that, oh, this policy can be effective to tackle that economic issue in general, okay? But imagine if you are a policy advisor, if you are an economic advisor writing a report for the government and recommending one policy, you need to support your policy. You need to explain why this one and not another. And you can't really do that job. You can't make a convincing argument and to convince people, the government or the president, that this is what we should do, unless you give evidence that you have analyzed the information at your disposal and that you have considered it carefully and that your recommendation is based on that information. Okay, so just like in paper 2, feel free to cite some of the information using quotation marks to refer to some values in the tables, to some trends you've identified in possible diagrams that you have been that were provided. So refer to the data, use the data to defend your policy, okay, to support your policy recommendation. You can't reach the top marks for this question if your answer is, let's say, too generic, if it does not use the information well. Clearly, there are several policy responses that can be adequate to solve one particular economic issue. It's not as if there were like a single possibility that is a single option that is better than the other ones. What the examiners will assess is your ability to defend one particular policy. Okay, it doesn't matter whether the examiner agrees with you or not on what should be the policy response. Okay, your job is just to write something that makes sense, that is adequately supported by the data, and of course that make economic sense. Otherwise, that's not going to look very good. But if it makes sense, if you support it well, that's fine. There are many possible policy response that can be appropriate to fix the same economic issue. Okay, so you need to recommend a single policy to achieve a given objective. You are a policy advisor, you're not a student. Okay, I wrote a few notes about that. Let me just review them. Okay. So in your answer, I checked the most recent mark schemes. Make sure you use economic terminology. Make sure you use keywords. If you fail to use enough keywords in your answers, you might not be able to reach full marks. Okay, if you say something like, oh, I think what we should do is to cut taxes. Okay, you could say that. Well, that's an expansionary fiscal policy. Okay. If you say something like, maybe we should lower the exchange rate. Okay, it's called a depreciation. It could be like a devaluation if it's in a fixed exchange rate regime. Okay, make sure you use the appropriate economic terminology. Try to recommend a policy that is very specific. Okay, the more specific, the better. If the policy you recommend is too vague, it's not going to be very convincing. Okay, if you say something like, well, we should implement a supply side policy, okay, why not? But you know that a supply side policy is like a family of so many possible policy tools. Are you talking about market based? Are you talking about interventionist? And even if you make it a bit more specific, looking at market based or interventionist, how do you implement your market-based supply-side policy? What do you do? Are you talking about labor market reforms? Are you talking about competition policies? So you see, try to ensure that your policy is specific. If you say something like, okay, we should cut taxes. All right, but what taxes? What taxes do you think should be cut? Should you rather cut like taxes on businesses, taxes on households? Should you cut regressive taxes like VAT? Should you see what we do with the tax revenue? Make sure that your policies are not too vague. If you say something like, oh, let's regulate, let's introduce some regulations. Okay, but what regulations? Okay, how can, because the regulation as a whole is too vague. If you something like, okay, maybe we can nudge people. Yeah, that's true, but how do you intend to nudge them? So your policy should be specific, as clear as possible. What else did I write? Okay, how do you structure your answer? That is important. First, you state the policy recommendation. So it could be something like, in order to blah, 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 objective, it is, I recommend that the government of blah, blah, blah uses the following policy response, and you just state the policy response. Then, once you have stated what you believe to be the best policy response, explain how it works and explain how this particular type of policy response is expected to fix the problem. So for this part, usually you don't really need the information, the text, the data. That's mostly economic theory, right? That's where you can talk about the effect of a contractionary fiscal policy, of carbon taxation, of a monetary policy, a supply side policy, protectionism, exchanging an exchange rate system, a price control. Okay, you use economic theory to explain how this policy can help solving the economic issue we are facing. Then you explain why you think this policy is suitable. So that's the part where you use the data, use the information. Okay, you explain the theory, but then it's important that you justify it, that you support it. Say, oh, I believe this is the best policy because, and that's where you use the data to support the relevance of that particular policy. Why is it the best policy response? Okay, it could be something like, oh, I think the best solution is to use, I don't know, an expansionary monetary policy rather than expansionary fiscal policy, because look, the data shows that the government already has a pretty big budget deficit. So if we use like an expansionary fiscal policy, it would make the deficit even bigger. So you see, you use the data to just explain why you think this is the best policy response. It's okay when you do that to talk about other possibilities, and that's what I just did. You see, when I compared an expansionary monetary versus an expansionary fiscal policy, I say, yeah, I think it's the best policy. We should use monetary rather than fiscal policy because we have a big deficit. So it's perfectly fine to compare your policy recommendation to alternatives, okay? Because if your job is to recommend the best policy, and there are many possibilities. So when you do that, when you explain why the policy is suitable, why it's the best option we have, the best response we have, it's perfectly fine to compare it with alternatives that are maybe less suitable, maybe less effective, given the data at your disposal. Another example, imagine you are given information about an economy whose interest rates are already, let's say, 0.5%, and it goes through a recession, and you have a question, recommend a policy to help the economy out of a recession, okay, to boost economic growth or to reduce unemployment. Well, clearly, the data shows that interest rates are already very low, so you are stuck in what we call the liquidity trap. So you can't really use an expansionary monetary policy. So in that case, you could say, well, I recommend the use of an expansionary fiscal policy by, and be specific, okay, by maybe decreasing VAT. Or by maybe not VAT because it's an indirect tax, but maybe by decreasing like income tax or corporate tax. I feel like this is a better option than an expansionary monetary policy because look, we are stuck in the liquidity trap, so it wouldn't work. So you see, it's fine to just compare your policy recommendation with weaker or less effective alternative and explain why these are alternatives that are not very suitable, that would not work so well. And finally, so remember, first we state what policy recommendation we make. Second, we explain how it works and how we can help the economy fix the problem that we are dealing with. Next, you explain why this policy is suitable, why you think it's the best possible response using the information provided. And finally, and I think this is important, um, recognize the limitations of this policy. But let me explain why this is important. No policy is perfect. Every policy um, can have some shortcomings, create some perverse incentives, uh, create some inefficiencies, lead to outcomes that were unexpected. Okay. And it's very likely, if not certain, that the same goes for the policy you recommend. And you are probably very much aware of these limitations. As an economic advisor, you must acknowledge those limitations. But of course, your job is not simply to say something like, oh, but this policy has problems, problem one, problem two, problem three, because otherwise you're not doing a very good job as an economic advisor. A better job consists in identifying the possible issues associated with the policy you recommend and to make suggestions on how to prevent those issues from arising. Okay? Let me give you an example. Imagine that you have a question like, okay, recommend a policy to control inflation. Inflation is too high. We want to control it. And you decided that the best course of action is to implement a contractionary fiscal policy by raising taxes. Okay, sure. You can explain how it works, you can explain why you think it's the best policy response, and then finally, think about the possible limitations associated with higher taxes. One obvious limitation is the risk of tax avoidance or tax evasion. It's important that you recognize that this is something that can undermine the effectiveness of your policy. But instead of just stating or just recognizing that this is a problem that exists, make additional recommendations on how we can address this possible risk. So you could say something like raising taxes may encourage tax avoidance and tax evasion, and therefore it is important that we enforce or we implement stricter rules or penalties to penalize those who engage in such practices in order to reduce the incentives to cheat, to avoid taxes. So you identify the possible limitation and you make a suggestion on how we can address this risk, how we can diffuse this the potential negative impact of the policy. Other example, what if you have a question on negative externalities, pollution, for example? You could say something like, I believe that the best policy is to use laws and regulations. setting some new rules, stricter rules that businesses or households will have to follow, and that will determine how much pollution they can generate. Okay, whatever regulation. You know that one limitation of this policy that can undermine its effectiveness is how well they are enforced. If you have a rule, a regulation that is not adequately enforced, it's not going to be very effective. Okay, so you can still suggest that we should implement specific regulations to address the problem. Recognize the limitation. However, um, there is a chance that the rule will not be enforced properly, and then make additional suggestions on how we can, what the government could do to ensure proper enforcement of the regulation. It could be to create a dedicated agency that will screen the behavior of businesses or households to ensure they comply with the regulations. It could be again to impose very heavy sanctions on those firms or individuals who do not meet or who do not comply with the regulations. Okay, but you can't be a good economic advisor if you do not recognize the limitations of the policy you recommend and if you do not make suggestions on how we can control those limitations. To summarize, 4 steps when answering this type of question. State the policy that you believe the government should implement. Explain the theory using economic terminology, of course. Justify why this is, in your opinion, the best policy response using the data that is provided. So why is it the most suitable economic policy? Feel free to compare this policy with less suitable, less relevant alternative policies. Again, using the data to justify why they are not as good as the policy you recommend. And finally, state or recognize the existence of possible issues or limitations associated with the policy you recommend, and suggest how we can control, how we can address these limitations. If you have all that, you're good. You're gonna have a great score for that, for these questions, for these policy recommendations. And again, request additional paper for the policy recommendation because the box you have is really short and you should not feel limited to writing inside the answer boxes. Maybe something I haven't discussed, do you need to use diagrams for the policy recommendation? You can, but it's not required. So unless you feel like one diagram could add substantial value to your policy recommendation, if there is really something you want to show and you don't know how else to show it, but using a diagram, but usually you're not expected to use diagrams in the policy recommendation. And I think I went through everything that I listed. Yes, okay. Well, that concludes this series of videos on how to nail the IB economics exam. Good luck, everybody, and see you soon.